So, let's see if I can get done this faster than I did it last week. Hindsight. Rear end of the cow. 48. 48 was the state average. And that's 5 bushels less than the year before. We're basically in soybean yield territory, which is somewhat depressing. The question then, of course, since I would, Betsy, when we talk about data wonks and number wonks, you and I should have a competition and see who is the bigger wonk when it comes to data. Because depending on how you look at this data, you could say, well, there's a trend line, you know, and if that trend line, if I do a linear regression starting in 2017, kind of mimics income one, doesn't it? 2017, we've been skidding down that hill in a hurry. At that rate, I should be completely without yield in another, let's say 7 years, which is still not early, it's still too early for me to retire. So we better break this line. We had, by all accounts, a really good early start. Why? Because we were already dry the previous fall, and so since most of the prevent plant acres were actually workable too, we actually overall had a pretty nice early start. And then it got dry early. How dry? Well, on the station, we had the second driest first half. In other words, the first 6 months was the second driest ever recorded. And it was the driest first 9 months. And you should be really, really happy that it started raining just before beet harvest. Or those piles right now would be in a world of hurt. Dry beets don't store worth a crap. And those beets got some water and they soaked it up like dry sponges, which didn't help sugar for a little bit, but then we had some really nice weather that delayed harvest. The fact that the rain came, it came in just the right time to really help sugar beets. It didn't help wheat whatsoever. We lived on borrowed water pretty much the whole year. But the other interesting thing is, we had a pretty warm summer. And across the state, all kinds of records were broken for hottest record for average temperature. So the average daily temperature is the nighttime low and the daytime high. Okay, to get to those records, it wasn't because we had a lot of 100-degree days. We actually had, across most of the state, fewer 90-degree days than a lot of other warm summers, especially as you go further east and south. Okay, what does that mean? How can I have the hottest summer and not have a lot of 90-plus degree days? How can I still be the hottest summer?
Solar cycle.
Now, think about the sun.
Stays warm at night.
Stays warm at night. Stays warm at night. Okay, what have you always heard me say about small rains and warm nights? They don't like it. We're a cool season grass. And so that didn't help our crop. I think the exception to some extent was the Northwest. Our dew points were pretty high. When did you turn the air conditioning on in your house? Because that really is a good indication. If you can't sleep at night with the windows open, it generally is a pretty good indication that the weather is turning kind of sour for small rains. Now, the interesting overall is the extreme variability that we saw within a farm. So old sugar beet ground, old sunflower ground were disastrous, especially between Fisher and Crookston. There were guys that barely got into 3-digit yields because there was no water to begin with, and it only got worse. Then there was regional variability. So if you were just north of Warren and you got 3 inches out of the 7-inch thunderstorm that ripped kind of from Oslo, kitty corner over to Argyle, and you didn't have your quarter underwater for 4 days, but you caught 3 inches of that water, you were looking at averages in the 80 on the farm, on some fields. And so, extreme variability within the region and across the state. So, that was the hindsight. Well, we had some really interesting surprises. You've heard me say that plant breeders go gray, bald, and grumpy as their careers advances. And the reason for that is, you think you had a winter, and then the next year happened. And that's called genotype by environment interaction. Varieties responding differently to changing circumstances, changing growing conditions. And, oh, did we have a textbook this last season? So, little intermission. You guys want the data faster and faster. That might be because the sales agronomist comes to you and tells you, if you don't buy the seed now, it will be sold out. And that might just be a tactic to avoid actually seeing the data. Because generally, the university, we're not quite the government, but close enough that we would check, recheck, and then we finally feel comfortable enough that we would release our data in early January. Okay, for the last 2 decades, we pushed that to early November, end of October. You get period grades. It has all the data in it, and we still call it preliminary data. Okay, that wasn't good enough. Because you would call me and go, Jochum, I saw you running around with the combine. Got any data? Yeah. Can you share it? No. But we changed a couple of things. I can't get you all the data, but I can get you yield data now within days of you seeing me running around with the combine. What that looks like is, this is the web page, and it's now varietytrials.umn.edu. And then we have this handy dandy little, this is a Google sheet actually. And that Google sheet I can update even on my phone. So if I get out of the combine, download the data from the combine, the yield data off the combine, if I had just one little stats app that would allow me to calculate reasonable means, I can post that actually while driving. Oh no, you're not allowed to do that. On the website, and get you the means with actually somewhat of an estimate of how good or how bad the trial was, basically looking at the LSD. So if I have, and this is where the preliminary really comes in. Sometimes we monkey with the data. Remember that very famous slogan, you know, something about statistics and liars use statistics. I have to look at a little digging into the data to see if I have to throw some data points out and get a better estimate of what the performance was of an individual entry. But for all practical purposes, most of the time I can get you reasonable data set within days after the combine. So that's what it will look like. This happens to be the winter rye data. Don't look at the means. So, UMM releases, the latest one was Torgey, Linkert, the 2013, had a really good run. It's still third in the state, but it got knocked off from its first place that it held for the last 5 years. The newest stuff from the privates. Notice a couple new names, Champions Alliance Group, Peterson Farm Seeds. You know Peterson mostly from soybean genetics. That's how they make their start and their mark. Once Roundup Ready became available as a seed, they were starting to basically become a retailer of genetics. I love when they come up with a variety name like Buns. Champions Alliance Group 2, they don't have their own breeding program. They're buying their genetics. We still get them to test all of them, which is kind of nice. There's only one company that retails genetics that isn't in our trials. You want me to keep moving, right? No? Never mind. It's going to make a joke. And that's CHS. CHS is the only one that doesn't enter their genetics in our variety trials. So the variety survey. 95-90 became the largest variety. Valda kept its second place. Lincoln dropped to third. 94-79 stayed fourth. And then Murdoch made a big splash. And that's where the story of GBE really starts. It's amazing to see something what it did. So, this is a location summary. And this is really shows you what, in the Roseau, I still averaged 90 bushels in the trial. I had entries there that were in the 3 digits. Becker is irrigated, and there was only 42 as an average because they didn't turn the water on early enough. But Pearly, not too far from here, averaged 85 bushels. And you go like, what? How can I have a yield trial in Pearly where it didn't rain all that much, barely any, still average 85 bushels per spring wheat in the trial? No, I wasn't smoking crack when I was combining or any other, too much coffee, whatever it was. How can I have 85 bushels? Do I know my math? This is not kilograms per hectare. This is bushels per acre. Any ideas? Stored water, prevent plant. This was corn acres. This was literally living on borrowed, basically water that was there left from the fall of 2019. It's heavy clay ground, and he barely could get it worked. He worked it once in 20 in the fall, and he could barely work it in 21 in the spring. That's how heavy this ground is. And so we're just living on borrowed water. Now, I like to look, this is just for my own information. Basically, in our yield trials, I always try to basically maximize grain yield of all the varieties and then separate them out a little bit for grain protein. Because if I fertilize too much, I'm compressing that grains in protein again. If I fertilize not enough, then I probably have some entries where I didn't maximize grain yield. So I'm trying to hit the sweet spot. And the sweet spot is probably somewhere from 0.15 to about 0.22. Anything above that, like here, I over-fertilized. Here, I probably under-fertilized. And so that helps me a little bit gauging of how good the trials are, how bad the trials are. So, single year comparisons. I am not going to regurgitate all the tables. You can find them online for yield. What I do is, this is what I call my second tier interpretation. I take all those means for grain yield and grain protein, and then I come up with these scatter plots. Now, this is not grain protein content. This is grain protein yield, pounds of protein per acre produced. Think of this as sucrose per acre for those of you that are sugar beet growers. Okay? This is still grain yield. I don't have bushels there. It's percent of the meat. Doesn't change anything. Red, this red line basically denotes 14% protein because that's what the market wants. So if you are above the red line, the average protein in the trial for that variety is above 14. If it's below the red line, the variety was an average below 14. The actual distance, data wonk. Let's wonk out on the data. You could actually calculate the percent protein if you measured the distance of the red line to this point, the perpendicular distance. It's a little vector, matrix algebra you can let loose on that. I'm not going to do it. Don't worry. Just look at the meat in the table. But you can see Buster really is not a great protein variety. Neither is Trigger. This is in 2020. Bowls is by far the highest protein variety, but 9590 makes more protein per acre. And just eked in right around 14% average across the locations in the north. Okay, now let's see what happened in 2021. Well, first of all, everything now, except for just a few, are above 14%. So that's already 1 GB. But most varieties did responded somewhat equal. The ones that are really outliers, Linkard, Murdoch, and Trigger. Trigger flipped up lower, much lower compared to the other varieties in the amount of protein produced per acre. Murdoch, same thing. It took it on the chin. Linkard bumped up a little bit. Bowls, if you take the distance from here, is still by far the highest protein variety. So that didn't change. But we see some things really flipping around. Okay, what happens when you start looking at multiple year data? Why do we look at multiple year data? Well, the only reason we do yield trials is not to prove the past. That's the hindsight. That's the rear of that darn cow. We really want to sample as many locations as possible in the sense that you have a feel for what can happen next year. Okay, did anybody anticipate what happened this past season during the winter? Were we going to have the driest first 6 months in the valley ever recorded? Do you know that? I didn't. You know, it's relatively variable here. And so that makes it hard. So we have kind of a year like this really throws some monkey wrenches in the data. And so the question when you're going to ask me, well, what we're going to do for next year, I'm still somewhat uncertain. I'm more uncertain than Betsy is. Because I think the weather is more variable than the markets are. So I'm still torn. But if you look at multiple year data, this is what happens. So, 2 years of data in the Northwest. Oh, Trigger shows up where it's supposed to be. I averaged out Murdoch. You know, remember it was hanging out here in 21, and in 20 it was hanging out here, so it pulls it back to where it kind of should be. Linkard is still there, but a little bit higher than I would have anticipated on average. Now look at the 3-year data. Well, Linkard there. Now Trigger really is one of the lower protein varieties again. And that's what I would have anticipated. If I grow Linkard of Trigger next year, I would still expect it to be one of the lowest protein varieties. It might be above 14. You saw that how that whole everybody switched up to higher protein, but it's not going to all of a sudden be the top. The one that really is a monkey wrench. Oh, I can't go back. That's right. Let's not try that. Was Murdoch, and I'll show you some more Murdoch data. So, in each of those plots that I just showed you, that average, that's just a little dot on that paper. But around that dot, I could actually make somewhat of an ellipse that captures all the data that contributed to that little dot. It's just an average of 10 locations in the north. Now the size and the shape and how big or how small that elliptical is varies for each of those varieties. And you guys want to have predictability. You want to have what we call stability. You don't want to have unpleasant surprises. So I came up with this rank stability measurement. And basically what it is, in every single location in each trial, the variety, if it was number 1, gets rank 1. If it was the 30th in the trial, it's rank 30. Okay, I have 10 locations, 10 different ranks. I average those out, That's what the bottom here is, the average rank of that particular variety across all those test locations. And because I have an average and I have the individual rank of each location, I can make an estimate of how variable that data was, and that's called a variance of ranks. And that's the y-axis. And so you get this scatter of individual plots where we know trigger is going to be one of the highest yielding varieties. So it has the lowest average rank. It's always second, third, first, but it's never going to be 30th. So this is 20 data again. Trigger is here, linked is there, on the other side of the spectrum, and in between you have all the other varieties. Now, not to bore you again with a whole bunch of statistics, you expect varieties in this middle group to change rank more often. The extremes are going to be most extreme. The ones in the middle are going to, relative to one another, have more rank changes. What is interesting are some really bouncing back and forward. So for 3555, for instance, or for 3055, for instance, to come up with an average rank about 15, there had to be locations, if it has this much variability, where it was close to the top, and in other cases where it fell all the way to the bottom. Otherwise, you couldn't get that large of an estimate. Okay, varieties that are very high in grain protein and low yield end up here. High yield, low protein end up here. But some of the varieties that are most interesting, that what we call those balanced varieties, fish nor fowl, but don't get you caught with really low protein or protein that's way too high where the market will not reward you for it, are going to be all in this middle group. How can I now say which one is better? Which one is more consistent? Well, again, there's some statistics involved in this, but basically, this is the take-home for you. Anything below the blue line is more consistent relative to varieties that are above the blue line in the same kind of group. So Shelley bounces around more than Volta does. Spitfire is more consistent than Ranchero. Rollock bounces around more than Bulls. Everybody with me? Okay, so this was 20. 20 was in many ways a pretty average, consistent, normal year. Look at 21. Trigger's still there. Normally trigger hangs out here. Oops. 5 more? I got more slides than 5. Look at Murdoch. Dead last. Average rank. That's called G by E. Murdoch went on its chin. Hard. Can I explain it? No. Was it diseases? No. Because we hadn't had no diseases. For diseases, you need to have water. We had none of that. Linker, more variable. So, what happens when I now do that multiple year thing? Well, things are starting to kind of make more sense. Trigger ends up a little bit more on this side again. Murdoch is still up high, but it's in the middle of the group now because I had 20 data, 2020 data in there. And then by the time you have 3-year data, things start to make sense again in what I would expect varieties to do. Assuming we have an average year next year. And that's the big assumption. So, lodging, since I have only 5 minutes, you can look at this. Why does a whole bunch of varieties have no ratings? Well, for a rating to be assigned, you have to have lodging. We didn't have any lodging last year. Heck, most of the trials had barely got above my calves. And so the chances of it going down were slim to none. BLS, likewise. Too dry, we couldn't support the imperial leaf streak anywhere. FHB, we never assigned based on 1-year data, but this is at least inoculated nurseries. And we did have good disease scores. So I would expect that the 1-year entries next year will all have an assigned rating. We knocked a couple of them last year. We put Bowles to a 5, and Linkert became a 5. But there's some really good options, in the 3s and 4s for varieties. So the bottom line, I'm still a lousy meteorologist, and we all know that what we have, the market doesn't want, and vice versa, because what we have is what all your neighbors have too. So, the picks, nothing with an FHB score over 5, or a BLS score over 5, nothing with a pre-harvest sprouting rating over 2. Then we have, and I'm a little bit different than Jim's. I include SY611CL2, as does Jim, as a balanced variety. Basically, to replace Ingmar, and Murdoch fell out of favor based on this last year's data. We keep Balda in it. We added McLeod, kind of as a more towards the high protein side, in favor of Bowles. We keep 3530 in it as a balanced variety. We keep Washburn and Torgy in there, kind of as a nice all-around package. We drop Shelley. We keep Linkert in there, basically almost because we have to, because it's still the 3rd variety in total acreage. So something new. Very briefly, we're going to release Rothsay, which is a cross between Prosper and Minnesota line back across to Norton. It's a good combination of yield and protein, kind of like a Torgy, but the advantage that Rothsay will have over Torgy is that it has much better straw strength than Torgy does. We're very comparable to Linkert, but we're giving up some of the disease, both in BLS as well as scab. The rest of them are pretty comparable. With that, that's the last one. With that, any questions? Including those on diseases, insects, aphids. Well, aphids are insects, sorry. New fungicides. Yes?
In your yield trials, did the covalent values go up this year?
Oh yeah, did they go up a little bit? So LSDs go up a little bit in, actually your LSD value in relationship to the mean of the variety tends to go up in years like this. So it's harder to start distinguishing varieties. It's a little bit of a mathematical thing. So another way to look at that, were the CVs of our trials slightly higher. So the coefficient of variation, the CV values, did go up a little bit. Not in a variety like location like Roseau. We use a methodology now called nearest neighbor and mixed models with restricted maximum likelihood estimates, also known as BLUES, Best Linear Unbiased Estimator. And you all went, I don't give a crap. But that allows us to still use this data when it's a little bit more variable and not have to throw locations away, because that's the worst.
So do you find more bulletproofing then?
No, the bulletproofing comes in when I have more data points, more environments. So this only helps me in a individual location to say I can still use this data. But the bulletproofing, as far as purpose of a yield trial to predict next year, that only improves if I have more environments, whether it's either years or locations. So I can tell you what variety to grow in the previous 9 years if I have 10 years of testing environments. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah.
I can always prove the past. It's about sampling. And the more environments we sample that are representative of what we think happens next year, the more robust all these graphs become. That's why a year like this throws you an absolute monkey wrench and makes breeders go gray, bald, and grumpy. If I was the breeder of Murdoch, and you would have asked, and I know the breeder of Murdoch, And I asked him in 20 what he thought of Murdoch. He goes, it looks good, because we had that conversation. I said, is it going to beat Valda? He goes, well, it's not going to beat Valda for yield, but I think everything else, it should beat Valda. Ha! Oops. Why? Because in the previous 5 years, it never encountered as dry a season across all the testing locations that they have. And so, running yield trials here is hard. So, what is going to happen next year? We're going to have an average year. I might still gamble with Murdoch. If I'm going to be as dry again as last year, I ain't ever going to grow Murdoch again, period. Okay, I'll be in the back.